Snow pressed down on the quiet streets of Helena, Montana, on a November night in 2011. 28-year-old Lauren Parker never made it safely through the night. By morning, her door stood unlocked, her home was silent, and her life had been stolen in a single act of brutal violence. For years, the case lay frozen in the archives of Montana law enforcement, while her family begged for answers and a community lived with fear. Then, nearly a decade later, a single strand of DNA and a new kind of science tore the case wide open, exposing a name no one expected. This is the story of how the cold case of Lauren Parker was finally solved, and how the arrest of a familiar face shook an entire community. Before we begin, subscribe and follow this channel. Every week, we uncover the world's most haunting cold cases, where silence may last for years, but secrets never stay buried. The city of Helena, Montana, on the evening of Saturday, November 12, 2011, was hushed beneath an early winter storm. Snow had fallen steadily since dusk, laying a powdery sheet across the rooftops, blanketing cars, and muffling every sound that might have carried through the narrow streets. It was the kind of night when families huddled indoors near fireplaces, when the town felt smaller, closer, and sealed away from the world. For 28-year-old Lauren Parker, the night began like so many others. She had spent the day working a long shift at the community health clinic, where she was known for her calm presence and gentle touch with patients. She was young but respected, balancing her career with the heavy demands of raising her 2-year-old daughter. Colleagues later described how she carried exhaustion in her shoulders, but always met people with a warm smile. At 7:30 that evening, Lauren left the clinic parking lot in her modest sedan. She stopped at a neighborhood gas station for milk and bread. Surveillance footage from the store would later provide the last clear look at her alive. She appeared bundled in a thick coat, her long dark hair falling from beneath a knitted wool hat. She smiled politely to the cashier, her eyes tired but kind, before walking back out into the cold night. By 8 o'clock, her car pulled into the driveway of her small 2-bedroom apartment on Lyndale Street. Neighbors sometimes waved to her as she carried groceries and her toddler up the short steps. That night, she settled in quickly. She tucked her daughter into bed, read her a short story, and turned out the light. Around 9 o'clock, she sent a text message to a close friend. "Baby's asleep. Finally, a quiet night." That message was the last confirmed sign of Lauren's life. From that moment until nearly 11 o'clock, the timeline grew hazy. At some point during that 90-minute window, someone came to her door. Investigators would later confirm there was no forced entry, no broken lock, no shattered window, no damage at all. Whoever stood at that threshold was someone Lauren recognized, or at least trusted enough to let inside. What happened next could only be reconstructed from the traces left behind. The bedroom bore signs of a struggle. Bedding torn loose, a pillow on the floor, a drinking glass shattered, water staining the sheets. On the doorframe, investigators would later discover a smear of blood. On the floor, deep scuff marks hinted at frantic resistance. The scene told a silent but violent story. Lauren had fought, but she had been overpowered. In the room next door, her daughter slept soundly through it all. The innocence of a child's sleep contrasted cruelly with the chaos just beyond the wall. By the time the city slipped deeper into the frozen night, Lauren Parker's home had fallen utterly silent. Her phone went dark, no further calls or messages. Outside, fresh snow drifted over footprints that might have led to answers. The small apartment, once a place of warmth, now held only stillness and the weight of violence. The following morning, Sunday, November 13th, Lauren's ex-husband arrived as he often did to pick up their daughter. He knocked several times, no response. He tried the handle. The door was unlocked. Inside, the hallway light was still on. Her coat lay draped over the sofa, as if tossed there in haste. The air felt heavy, wrong, almost staged in its stillness. He called her name, his voice breaking the silence. No answer. Only the whistle of wind sneaking through a cracked window. When he opened the bedroom door, his world collapsed. Lauren Parker lay lifeless on the bed, her face pale, eyes frozen in half-open terror. A pillow had fallen to the floor, a glass shattered at her side. Around her neck and arms were the unmistakable marks of a violent struggle. In that instant, one life was gone, another was forever changed, and an investigation was about to begin that would grip Helena for the next decade. The morning of Sunday, November 13th, 2011, began with a bitter chill that swept down from the Rocky Mountains. Helena's streets were silent, blanketed in fresh snow, with only the faint crunch of early footsteps breaking the calm. For Michael Carter, Lauren Parker's ex-husband, it was supposed to be a routine visit. He often came on Sundays to see their 2-year-old daughter, sharing custody in the careful rhythm they had established since their separation. He carried no expectation of what he was about to walk into, no preparation for the horror that awaited inside. Michael arrived just after 9 o'clock, parking his truck on Lyndale Street. The neighborhood was quiet, smoke curling from chimneys, neighbors still tucked inside their homes. He walked up the short steps to Lauren's door and knocked firmly, his breath rising in visible puffs in the cold air. There was no answer. He waited, then knocked again, louder this time. Still silence. Pressing his ear to the door, he thought he heard a faint sound, maybe the hum of a heater or the creak of floorboards. Something felt wrong. He twisted the handle gently, and to his surprise, the door opened easily. It was unlocked. Inside, the small apartment looked ordinary at first glance, but Michael immediately felt the weight of something unnatural. The hallway light was still burning. Her winter coat was draped across the sofa, as though tossed aside quickly. The air was unnervingly still, heavy with a silence that seemed to press on his chest. He called out, "Lauren?" His voice echoed down the narrow hall. No reply. He took a few hesitant steps forward, glancing toward the small bedroom where their daughter often slept. He peeked in, his heart pounding. The little girl was there, curled under a blanket, breathing softly. Relief washed over him for a moment, but it was fleeting. Something in the air, something in the apartment told him not everything was safe. He turned toward Lauren's room. The door was ajar. With trembling fingers he pushed it open. The sight that met him froze him in place. Lauren lay on the bed, motionless. Her body was angled awkwardly, hair tangled across the pillow. Her eyes were half open, staring into nothing. The bedding was pulled askew, a pillow had fallen to the floor, and a shattered glass lay in a dark water stain on the sheets. Bruises were visible across her neck and arms, the unmistakable signs of a violent struggle. Michael staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. The reality crashed in on him all at once. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. He dialed 911, his voice breaking as he tried to explain what he was seeing. "She's not breathing. My ex-wife, please, you have to come. She's gone, she's gone." Within minutes, the sound of sirens cut through the quiet of Lyndale Street. Red and blue lights splashed across the snow as patrol cars pulled up, tires crunching over the ice. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains and cracked doors, their faces pale with worry. Officers rushed inside, securing the scene, ordering Michael outside while they checked the small apartment. They found what he had already seen. Lauren Parker was dead. Her daughter, miraculously untouched, still sleeping in the next room. The officers taped off the apartment, their yellow crime scene ribbon fluttering against the cold wind. The neighborhood filled with whispers. A mother had been murdered in her own home, while her child slept only steps away. For a city like Helena, where most residents still left their doors unlocked and greeted neighbors by name, the discovery was unthinkable. By 10 o'clock that morning, the quiet street was lined with patrol cars, a forensic van, and clusters of stunned neighbors. The ordinary Sunday had transformed into a nightmare, and the name Lauren Parker was about to become forever tied to one of Montana's most haunting murder investigations. When the first patrol officers entered Lauren Parker's apartment on that frigid Sunday morning in November 2011, they immediately sensed the gravity of the scene. The call had come through dispatch as an unresponsive female. By the time they crossed the threshold, it was clear they weren't dealing with a medical emergency. This was a crime scene. Officer Daniel Ruiz was the first through the door. He paused in the narrow hallway, taking in the coat left across the sofa, the faint smell of spilt water, the eerie quiet. A second officer followed, her flashlight sweeping across the small living room. Both instinctively reached for their radios. "Dispatch, confirm this is a possible homicide. Send detectives and forensics. We need the coroner on standby." In the bedroom, Lauren Parker lay lifeless. Her body told a silent but undeniable story. Dark bruises circled her neck. Defensive scratches marked her arms. A pillow and a broken glass were scattered on the floor. The bedding was twisted, showing signs of resistance. Every detail spoke to violence. Ruiz motioned for Michael Carter, Lauren's ex-husband, to step back into the living room. Michael was pale, trembling, barely able to stand. His sobs echoed through the hall, carrying out into the cold street where neighbors were beginning to gather. Ruiz placed a hand on his shoulder, keeping his voice steady. "Sir, we need you outside. This is now a restricted scene." Outside, the flashing lights of additional patrol cars illuminated Lyndale Street. Officers began stringing yellow crime scene tape across the front steps, forcing neighbors to retreat to the sidewalks. A growing crowd of onlookers whispered, some clutching children close. In a town like Helena, where most residents still left doors unlocked at night, the thought of a violent murder inside a family home was almost unimaginable. Within the hour, Detective Laura Bennett arrived. A seasoned investigator with a reputation for meticulous work, she ducked under the crime scene tape and entered the apartment with deliberate care. She scanned the hallway, noting the absence of forced entry. The door showed no signs of damage. Whoever had entered, Lauren had likely let them in. Inside the bedroom, Bennett stood silently for several moments, absorbing the scene. She noted the broken glass, the water stain spreading across the sheet, the disheveled bedding, and the position of Lauren's body. She leaned in, observing the bruises around the neck, the pale skin, the unmistakable signs of a struggle. Turning to the officers beside her, she spoke in a low but certain voice. "This was not an accident. This is homicide." By mid-morning, the Lewis and Clark County forensic team arrived in their white hazmat suits, carrying cameras, evidence kits, and fingerprint powder. They moved with precision, documenting everything. Photographs flashed continuously, capturing every angle of the room. They collected shards of the broken glass, sealed stray hairs in envelopes, and swabbed what appeared to be a small smear of blood on the bedroom door handle. On the porch outside, they discovered a set of footprints leading up to the entrance. The prints were deep, likely from a heavy man. Molds were made on the spot before the melting snow could distort them. Meanwhile, paramedics quietly carried out their duty of confirming the obvious. Lauren Parker was beyond resuscitation. Her time of death was recorded as sometime during the night, though the exact hour would have to wait for the autopsy. They covered her body with a white sheet and prepared her for transport to the state crime lab in Missoula. Detective Bennett gathered the initial details. Michael Carter explained his arrival, the unanswered knocks, the unlocked door, the discovery. His hands shook as he recounted what he saw, his voice cracking each time he mentioned their daughter, who had slept through the night only steps away from her mother's final struggle. The officers escorted the child out carefully, shielding her from the flashing lights and murmurs of the crowd. Neighbors lowered their voices, eyes following the small girl carried down the steps by a social worker. The sight pierced through the onlookers more sharply than the police tape or the flashing lights. By early afternoon, the crime scene was sealed, evidence bags stacked in marked containers, and the house officially logged as an active homicide investigation. Reporters from the Helena Independent Record had already gathered on the street. Cameras pointed toward the small apartment. The first headline would soon appear online. Helena woman found dead in home. Police investigating suspicious circumstances. For Detective Bennett, the scene etched itself into memory. The absence of forced entry, the signs of a personal attack, the vulnerable child asleep in the next room, each detail deepened the urgency. Helena was no longer just a quiet mountain town blanketed in snow. It was the scene of a murder, and the hunt for justice had begun. On the afternoon of Sunday, November 13, 2011, Lauren Parker's body was transported to the Montana State Crime Lab in Missoula. The forensic van moved slowly across icy roads, its lights muted, carrying not only the remains of a young mother but the single most important piece of evidence in what was quickly becoming Helena's most haunting case. At the lab, Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Richard Carlson prepared to oversee the autopsy. With more than 2 decades of experience, he had examined thousands of deaths, but cases involving young women taken violently always weighed heavily on him. As he read the preliminary file, his jaw tightened. Female. 28 years old. Found unresponsive in her own bedroom. Apparent homicide. Cause of death pending. Under the cold fluorescent lights of the examination room, Lauren's body was laid out with solemn care. A hush filled the space. The staff moved with quiet precision, documenting every detail. The first step was the external examination. Dr. Carlson traced the distinct bruising around her neck. The marks formed irregular arcs, consistent with strangulation. He also noted smaller contusions on her arms and wrists. These, he concluded, were defensive wounds, signs that Lauren had tried desperately to fight back against her attacker. Further inspection revealed swelling on her forehead and a small laceration in her hairline. The injury suggested blunt force trauma, possibly from being struck or from hitting a hard surface during the struggle. Combined with the ligature-style bruising around her neck, the picture became tragically clear. Lauren Parker had been violently restrained, overpowered, and ultimately suffocated. Samples were collected methodically. Blood, hair strands, tissue, and fluids were carefully extracted, labeled, and sealed. Each vial carried her name, the case number, and the precise time of collection. One assistant swabbed beneath her fingernails, noting traces of skin tissue. That sample alone could prove invaluable, potentially carrying the attacker's DNA if Lauren had managed to scratch her assailant in the chaos of her final moments. As the hours passed, Dr. Carlson dictated his findings. He described the bruising patterns, the defensive wounds, the blunt force trauma. His voice was steady, but his words were grave. Cause of death, manual strangulation combined with secondary blunt force trauma to the head. Manner of death. Homicide. The autopsy revealed another crucial detail. There was evidence of sexual assault. Carlson paused as he wrote the notation, aware of the added horror it represented. For investigators, this was more than a murder. It was an act of violation layered upon violence. More samples were taken, sealed under the strictest protocols. Every step was double-checked and countersigned to ensure the evidence could stand in court. Meanwhile, back in Helena, the forensic team continued its sweep of Lauren's apartment. Technicians in white suits combed through every corner. They dusted for prints on the doorframes and furniture. They used ultraviolet light to scan the bedding and walls. They photographed shoe prints preserved in the snow outside her porch, creating silicone molds before the fragile impressions could fade. Each photograph, each evidence bag, became another puzzle piece. On the bedroom doorknob, a small smear of dried blood was collected. On the sheet, dark hairs that did not match Lauren's were sealed into envelopes. In the corner of the room, investigators noted fibers that seemed out of place, possibly transferred from the attacker's clothing. By the end of the day, nearly 30 pieces of evidence had been catalogued and sealed. The case file thickened quickly, filled with tags, signatures, and meticulous notes for Detective Laura Bennett. The results of the autopsy and the evidence sweep were both devastating and crucial. The confirmation of homicide, the signs of sexual assault, and the DNA samples meant the case now hinged on science. She told her team that night, "The killer left us something. DNA does not vanish. He may think he escaped, but his blood is here, his skin is here, his trace is here. One day it will lead us to him." As darkness fell over Helena once more, the community grieved in shock. A mother had been murdered in her own home, and though investigators now held the evidence of her final struggle, the identity of the man who took her life remained a mystery. In the days following the discovery of Lauren Parker's body, Helena shifted from quiet grief to restless speculation. The crime had shattered the city's sense of safety, and Detective Laura Bennett knew the pressure to find a suspect was mounting quickly. Inside the police station, a large whiteboard filled with names, timelines, and fragments of evidence became the focal point of the investigation. The first person to be questioned was Michael Carter, Lauren's ex-husband. He was the one who had found her body, and although his distress had seemed genuine, investigators could not overlook the possibility of his involvement. Domestic cases often began close to home. Detectives sat across from him in a cold interrogation room, the overhead lights casting sharp shadows across his tired face. Michael insisted that on the night of November 12th he had been at his parents' home, watching television until late. He admitted that he and Lauren had argued in the past, especially over custody of their daughter, but he swore he would never harm her. His statement was calm, but his alibi rested on family testimony, which detectives viewed as less than airtight. For now, he remained on the board. The second potential suspect was Ethan Reynolds, Lauren's boyfriend of 4 months. He was 32 years old, an information technology technician who had recently moved to Helena. Ethan told police he had been out with friends watching a basketball game at a bar the night Lauren was killed. The problem was that no receipts or surveillance confirmed his story, and the acquaintances he named could not provide precise times. To investigators, his alibi was shaky at best. During questioning, he appeared cooperative, but his eyes darted nervously each time detectives pressed him about the window between 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock, the very hours when Lauren was believed to have died. Beyond Lauren's close circle, other names began to surface. Neighbors reported seeing a man in a black pickup truck driving slowly through Lyndale Street around 9:30 on the night of the murder. No one could identify him, but the sight raised suspicion. Another neighbor mentioned a drifter who was often seen rummaging through trash cans near the area. His name, eventually uncovered, was Douglas Harper, a 41-year-old transient with a record of petty offenses. Police considered him worth questioning. Detectives also looked into Lauren's workplace. As a health worker, she interacted with dozens of people daily. Could a patient or colleague have followed her home? Interviews with co-workers painted Lauren as well-liked and dedicated. A nurse recalled that she had left her shift at 7:30 in the evening, appearing relaxed, and had said cheerfully, "See you tomorrow." That statement struck investigators hard because tomorrow had never come. As the list of names grew, Detective Bennett gathered her team. On the whiteboard, she wrote 3 categories: close relations, known associates, and unknown individuals. Under close relations, she listed Michael Carter and Ethan Reynolds. Under known associates, she placed colleagues and casual friends. Under unknown individuals, she added Douglas Harper and the driver of the black pickup. She reminded the team that the absence of forced entry suggested Lauren had known or trusted the killer. That fact, though not absolute, kept Michael and Ethan squarely in focus. As the days stretched into weeks after the murder of Lauren Parker, the investigation began to feel like a maze with no exit. The evidence collected from her apartment was extensive, but without an immediate DNA match, detectives were left chasing shadows. Each lead seemed promising at first, only to dissolve into frustration. One of the first false leads centered on Douglas Harper. The drifter neighbors had seen wandering Lyndale Street on the night of the murder. Harper was 41 years old, tall, with a lanky build, and often seen wearing a tattered coat. His reputation in Helena was that of a harmless vagrant, someone who scavenged through garbage cans for bottles and food. Yet, to frightened residents, he suddenly looked like a predator hiding in plain sight. Police quickly tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. Sitting in the interrogation room, Harper appeared nervous, sweating beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. He admitted that he had passed through the area on the night in question, but insisted he had never entered Lauren's home. "I just look through the trash for bottles. That is all I do," he muttered repeatedly. His words seemed unconvincing to many, but when his DNA was tested, the results cleared him completely. He was released, exhausted and humiliated, disappearing once again into Helena's cold streets. The second lead emerged from whispers about a young man named Travis Cole. He was 29 years old, known in the Helena Valley for his struggles with drugs and a string of petty theft arrests. A handful of residents claimed they had seen him loitering near Lyndale Street in the days before the murder. Some swore they saw him knocking on doors asking for money. With his criminal record, Cole quickly became a person of interest. Police brought him in late one November evening. Thin, jittery, and wearing a jacket that reeked of smoke, Cole denied any involvement. "I was at my girlfriend's trailer, watching movies all night," he claimed. His girlfriend backed up the story but admitted they had been high on methamphetamines and could not recall the exact times clearly. His shaky alibi kept suspicion alive, but DNA testing once again ruled him out. His sample did not match the evidence collected from Lauren's body. He was charged only with drug possession and released. For the community, the release of both Harper and Cole was deeply unsettling. At first, neighbors had breathed sighs of relief, convinced that the police had found their suspect. But when the truth emerged, fear returned in full force. If neither man had killed Lauren Parker, then the real murderer was still free, perhaps living among them. Candlelight vigils were held outside St. Paul's Church, only a few blocks from Lauren's apartment. Hundreds gathered with candles flickering in the icy wind, their faces drawn with grief and anger. At one vigil, Lauren's best friend spoke to the crowd. Her voice trembled as she said, "Lauren was more than a victim. She was a mother, a friend, and she deserves justice. We cannot let this case go cold," the crowd answered with a chant that carried into the night. Justice for Lauren. Inside the police station, the mood was tense. The whiteboard, filled with names, was now scarred with red lines crossing out suspects. Only Michael Carter and Ethan Reynolds remained as central figures. Without a DNA match, though, detectives could not close in on either man. Detective Bennett reminded her team that patience and persistence were crucial. "The killer left his trace," she said. "It is here, sealed in those evidence bags. We may not have his name yet, but he is not invisible." Still, the longer the investigation dragged on without progress, the heavier the weight on the city became. Parents held their children tighter. Women double-checked locks at night. Neighbors who once greeted each other with warmth now eyed one another with suspicion. If Lauren could be attacked in her own home, no one truly felt safe anymore. By December, the Parker case had grown into more than a single tragedy. It was a wound on Helena's conscience, a reminder that violence could reach even the most ordinary of lives. And with no arrest in sight, the community's fear deepened, spreading like the Montana cold that winter. Meanwhile, the community buzzed with theories. Some whispered that Michael's grief had been staged. Others claimed Ethan's nervous demeanor was suspicious. In small-town Helena, rumors spread quickly, each one adding fuel to the fire of speculation. Yet, for all the questions swirling, there was one immutable truth. DNA evidence had been recovered. The unknown sample taken from Lauren's body did not match her or any immediate family. The killer had left a biological fingerprint. Detectives sent the samples to the Combined DNA Index System, known as CODIS, hoping for a match. Weeks would pass before results came back, and in that time, the weight of suspicion fell heavily on the men closest to Lauren. By the end of the first week, the investigation was thick with tension. Every interview, every rumor, every fragment of information seemed to circle back to the same two names. On the whiteboard, Detective Bennett underlined them in red. Michael Carter, Ethan Reynolds. "One of them is lying," she told her team. But the evidence would have to prove it. By the start of the new year in 2012, the murder of Lauren Parker had already begun to slip from the headlines. The Helena Independent Record still published occasional updates, but the once daily reports turned into shorter articles buried deep in the local section. For the detectives assigned to the case, the silence of the investigation grew heavier by the day. The DNA evidence remained their strongest lead. Samples had been sent to the Combined DNA Index System, known as CODIS, the national database containing millions of genetic profiles from convicted offenders and arrestees. Weeks passed. Then, in January, the results returned. No match. The words struck the investigative team like a hammer. The killer's DNA was preserved and undeniable, but it belonged to no one in the system. He had never been convicted of a crime that required DNA collection. To the investigators, he was a ghost. Detective Laura Bennett refused to give up. She called meeting after meeting, reviewing every timeline, every statement, every small detail collected in the first chaotic days. The board in the squad room still showed the two most likely suspects, Michael Carter and Ethan Reynolds. Yet, DNA had cleared neither man, and both remained under scrutiny only because of proximity and strained relationships with Lauren. Bennett pressed her team to keep looking, but the evidence was stagnant. In February, the department interviewed dozens more residents from Lyndale Street. Some remembered hearing faint noises that night, but none could provide anything useful. Others swore they had seen strange vehicles in the area, but descriptions were inconsistent and vague. Rumors spread faster than facts, and detectives struggled to separate useful information from neighborhood gossip. The Parker family, meanwhile, grew increasingly desperate. Lauren's parents called the station weekly, sometimes daily, asking for updates. Each time, Bennett gave them the same careful answer. "We are still working. We have not forgotten her." But privately, she felt the weight of failure pressing harder. By the summer of 2012, the active investigation slowed. Detectives were reassigned to other pressing cases. The Parker file thickened with reports and photographs, but produced no arrests. The evidence remained sealed in storage. Each item catalogued with precision, each sample preserved for testing that might one day yield answers. For the community, the absence of progress was deeply unsettling. Candlelight vigils continued, but attendance dwindled as time passed. What had once been an urgent demand for justice gradually shifted into a resigned fear. Some residents whispered that the killer must have been a transient, long gone from Helena. Others feared that he still lived among them, hiding behind a friendly smile, blending into ordinary life. The passage of time was hardest on Lauren's daughter. Too young to understand the events of that November night, she grew up in the care of her grandparents. They shielded her from the harshest truths, telling her only that her mother had been taken by someone very bad. As the years went on, she would look at photographs of Lauren smiling, holding her as a baby, and ask questions that her grandparents struggled to answer. By the end of 2013, the Parker case was officially labeled a cold case. The thick file, marked unsolved, was placed on a shelf in the Lewis and Clark County Sheriff's Archive, alongside dozens of others. The notes inside told a story of violence, unanswered questions, and a DNA sample waiting for a match that had not yet come. Detective Bennett wrote one final line in her notebook before the case was closed. "The killer left us his trace. DNA does not lie. He may be free, but not forever." Those words, though simple, became her vow. For Lauren Parker's family, the years ahead would be a long and bitter wait. Justice had not spoken, and Helena was left with an open wound, a constant reminder that sometimes, even in a small city surrounded by mountains, evil could hide in plain sight. For most cold cases, time is the cruelest enemy. Witnesses forget, files gather dust, and the public gradually looks away. But in the case of Lauren Parker, her family refused to let her memory fade. Their persistence turned what could have been just another unsolved homicide into a symbol of resilience for the entire city of Helena. Lauren's parents, Margaret and James Parker, were ordinary people who suddenly found themselves carrying an extraordinary burden. In the weeks after their daughter's murder, they had been consumed by grief. But as the years dragged on with no arrest, grief hardened into determination. Margaret began attending every city council meeting where law enforcement budgets were discussed. She stood and spoke directly to officials, reminding them that her daughter's killer was still free. "Do not forget Lauren," she would say, her voice trembling but firm. "Do not let her case slip into silence." James took a different route. He organized small community fundraisers to create the Lauren Parker Memorial Fund. At first, the money went toward helping his granddaughter's education, but soon the fund grew into something larger. It became a platform to raise awareness about cold cases and the importance of advancing forensic technology. Local businesses donated prizes for raffles, and neighbors gathered for auctions, where James would hold up a photo of Lauren and tell her story again and again. "We cannot rest," he said at one such event. "We owe it to her, and we owe it to this town." Every November, on the anniversary of Lauren's death, the family held a candlelight vigil at St. Paul's Church. At first, dozens came. Over the years, hundreds began to gather. The flickering light of candles in the cold Montana wind became a haunting sight. Reporters from local and even national outlets began covering the vigils, and Lauren's name reached far beyond Helena. Each year, Margaret repeated her vow into the microphones. "We will never stop asking. We will never stop fighting until justice is served." Social media also became a powerful tool. Lauren's younger cousin created a Facebook page called Justice for Lauren Parker. What started as a small online memorial grew into a digital community where residents of Helena and strangers from across the country shared posts, theories, and messages of support. Tips still trickled in, sometimes nothing more than rumors, but the page kept the case alive in public consciousness. Detective Laura Bennett, even after being reassigned to other cases, could not ignore the Parker family's persistence. Every year, when Margaret or James called the department, she took the call personally. She read through the file on late nights, determined not to let it slip completely into obscurity. One day, she told Margaret quietly during a vigil in 2016, "Science will catch up. We will find him." By 2018, the case had gained enough recognition that a national television program covering cold cases reached out to the family. An episode aired, showing old crime scene footage, interviews with neighbors, and tearful recollections from Margaret and James. Millions of viewers watched as the family pleaded for answers. The episode renewed attention across Montana, sparking fresh calls for the state to invest in advanced DNA technology. Lauren's daughter, who had been only 2 years old when her mother was taken, grew up under the watchful care of her grandparents. By the age of 9, she stood at one of the vigils holding a candle in her small hands. Photographs captured her solemn face lit by the flame, her presence a living reminder of the cost of unanswered violence. She rarely spoke to reporters, but her silence carried more weight than words. The Parker family's persistence did more than honor Lauren. It placed pressure on law enforcement and legislators alike. Their voices joined with others across the state, families of unsolved murder victims demanding progress. The message was clear. DNA evidence existed, but without new tools to analyze it, killers would continue to walk free. For Helena, Lauren Parker's case became more than a personal tragedy. It became a symbol of the community's refusal to let violence define them. Residents who had once whispered in fear now stood openly at vigils, lighting candles not just for Lauren, but for every victim without justice. Her name became a rallying cry, a reminder that behind every cold case file was a face, a family, and a promise that silence would not win. And while the years stretched on and the killer remained unnamed, the Parker family's persistence ensured one thing: Lauren was never forgotten. By the winter of 2019, nearly 8 years had passed since Lauren Parker was killed. The investigation had long been labeled a cold case, her file buried among hundreds of others in the Lewis and Clark County archives. Yet science was changing, and with it, the possibility of justice. That year, Montana's State Crime Lab in Missoula officially adopted forensic genealogy as an investigative tool. The method, already famous for solving the Golden State Killer case, allowed detectives to use partial DNA matches from open-source genealogy databases to build family trees and trace suspects. For Detective Laura Bennett, who had carried Lauren's case in the back of her mind for almost a decade, the news was nothing short of a breakthrough. She retrieved the Parker file from storage, dust settling on its thick cover. Inside, the evidence was preserved exactly as it had been in 2011. Swabs, hair samples, and above all, the crucial DNA profile from Lauren's body. It was the killer's fingerprint, locked away in glass vials. "This is our chance," she told her team. The evidence never disappeared. Now, we finally have the technology to use it. In early spring, the lab technicians carefully reopened the frozen sample. Wearing gowns, masks, and gloves, they extracted the genetic material and began sequencing it with modern equipment far more advanced than what existed in 2011. The process was meticulous, every droplet of DNA treated as precious. When the sequencing was complete, the results were uploaded to databases like GED Match and Family Tree DNA, where millions of Americans had voluntarily submitted their DNA for ancestry research. The first results trickled in slowly. The matches were not to the killer himself, but to distant relatives, third and fourth cousins, scattered across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. At first, it seemed like another daunting puzzle. But to genealogists, these fragments were the first stepping stones toward the truth. Working alongside Bennett, a team of genetic genealogists began mapping out a vast family tree. They dug into old census records, obituaries, marriage licenses, and property deeds. Each match from the database was traced backward through generations, then forward again to identify living relatives. Over months, the sprawling tree narrowed. Branches that once spanned hundreds of names were cut down by age, geography, and opportunity. By late summer, the field of possibilities had shrunk to just 3 family branches. One was centered in Billings, another in Bozeman, and one in Helena itself. The Helena branch immediately drew attention. It meant that the killer had likely lived near Lauren, perhaps even known her personally. Detective Bennett pinned the names to a board in her office, red string connecting lines of ancestry. At the center, circled in bold ink, was one man who stood out, a middle-aged mechanic named Mark Ellison. He had lived less than a mile from Lauren's apartment in 2011. His name had even surfaced briefly in the early investigation before being dismissed for lack of evidence. Now, the family tree placed him squarely within the genetic circle. Bennett remembered him well. He had been questioned once, claiming he was at his garage on the night of the murder. But the timeline had not fully aligned, and investigators at the time lacked the legal means to compel a DNA sample. Without proof, his name had faded into the background. Until now, the breakthrough was electrifying. After years of dead ends, they finally had a direction. Bennett called Lauren's parents privately to share the news. "We have identified a genetic line that points to a suspect," she explained. Margaret broke into tears. James gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. For them, it was the first real sign of hope in nearly a decade. The work was not over. Forensic genealogy had pointed the way, but it was not enough to convict. Investigators still needed a direct DNA match from Mark Ellison himself. That meant surveillance, patience, and careful planning. But for the first time in years, the long-frozen case was alive again. On a bulletin board in the station, Bennett wrote a new note in red. 2019. Forensic genealogy. Our last shot. The genealogical breakthrough of 2019 gave investigators something they had not held in almost a decade: direction. Yet, the challenge now lay in transforming a sprawling web of distant relatives into a single name that could stand in court. Detective Laura Bennett gathered her team in the cramped cold case office, its walls lined with files and faded photographs. On a whiteboard, she mapped out 3 major family branches identified through forensic genealogy. One was rooted in Billings, another in Bozeman, and a third in Helena. She underlined the Helena branch twice. "Our killer lived close enough to reach Lauren Parker on the night of her murder," she told the room. "If we focus on proximity, this is the branch that matters." The genealogists provided more detail. Within the Helena branch were a handful of living male relatives, each within the right age range at the time of the crime. Some lived hours away in other counties, but one name immediately stood out. Mark Ellison, a mechanic in his late 40s, had lived less than 1 mile from Lauren's apartment in 2011. He had even been questioned briefly in the days after her death, though investigators had lacked the tools to link him to the DNA found at the crime scene. Detective Bennett reopened the old notes from Ellison's interview. Back then, he claimed he had been working late in his garage on November 12th, fixing a customer's car until nearly midnight. but cross-checking with records revealed discrepancies. The customer later confirmed that the repair had actually been done 2 days earlier. A neighbor also remembered that Ellison's garage lights were out by 9:30 that evening, a critical window of time when Lauren was believed to have been killed. Other details from 2011 now carried new weight. Investigators had noticed a fresh scratch on Ellison's hand during questioning. He had brushed it off as an injury from working on an engine. Without DNA to compare, it was dismissed. But when Bennett read the line again in the file, she saw it differently. It could have been the mark of Lauren's desperate attempt to fight back. The genealogical data tightened the net. Ellison was a confirmed distant relative of the man whose DNA had been submitted to the genealogy database in Yellowstone County. Statistical analysis made it nearly certain that the DNA from Lauren's body belonged to Ellison or someone in his immediate family. The Helena branch had narrowed to a single name that fit every criterion. Still, science demanded certainty. The team needed Ellison's direct DNA to prove the connection beyond any doubt. That meant surveillance, collection, and patience. Investigators began reviewing Ellison's daily habits. He still worked at the same garage, often drinking beer after hours with friends. He smoked heavily, leaving cigarette butts scattered around his shop. These habits offered opportunity. For Bennett, the moment was both exhilarating and sobering. She gathered her team around the board and tapped Ellison's name. "We have circled him once before, and we lost him. This time, we cannot let him slip away. We need a clean DNA sample, collected legally, chain of custody airtight. If we get that, this case is no longer a mystery. It is solved." Meanwhile, word of progress leaked quietly into the community. At vigils, whispers spread that investigators were closing in on someone who had been overlooked years before. For Lauren's parents, Margaret and James, it was a fragile hope. They had lived nearly a decade haunted by uncertainty, and now they dared to believe that justice might finally have a name. By the close of 2019, the family tree that once spanned hundreds of names had narrowed to one: Mark Ellison, a man who fixed cars for neighbors, who lived less than a mile away, who had blended into the fabric of Helena for years. Soon, he would no longer be a shadow. Soon, the truth would have a face. The morning of March 17, 2020, began with a tense stillness. For nearly a decade, the murder of Lauren Parker had lingered like an open wound in Helena. Now, with a confirmed DNA match tying Mark Ellison to the crime, detectives prepared to make the arrest that would finally break the silence. Detective Laura Bennett arrived at headquarters before sunrise. The plan had been crafted carefully the night before, with the assistance of the county sheriff's office and a tactical team. Ellison was considered dangerous, unpredictable, and possibly armed. The arrest would have to be swift and overwhelming, leaving no room for resistance. At 8 o'clock sharp, unmarked vehicles rolled quietly down the street leading to Ellison's garage. Officers in tactical gear positioned themselves at both exits. Another team surrounded his modest house just blocks away, in case he had already left for the day. Radios crackled softly, and then Bennett's calm voice cut through. "We move on my command." Ellison emerged from his garage wearing grease-stained coveralls, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He carried a toolbox in one hand, walking toward a customer's truck parked outside. In that moment, the team surged forward. "Police, hands up!" shouted one officer. Weapon trained on him. Ellison froze, his cigarette dropping to the pavement. His eyes darted wildly as officers rushed in from both sides. For a moment, it seemed he might run, but within seconds he was pinned against the hood of his truck, his hands wrenched behind his back. Cold steel cuffs clicked into place. Neighbors spilled out of their homes, drawn by the sudden commotion. From porches and windows, they watched as Ellison, a man they had known for years as the friendly neighborhood mechanic, was led away in chains. The scene shocked them. Some whispered in disbelief. Others stood in silence, unable to reconcile the man fixing their cars with the image of a murderer. As officers loaded him into the back of a patrol car, Bennett stepped forward. She looked directly at him and spoke with measured words. "Mark Ellison, you are under arrest for the murder of Lauren Parker." Ellison's face twitched, his expression shifting from confusion to anger. "You've got the wrong guy," he muttered, shaking his head. But his protests rang hollow. In Bennett's hands was the lab report confirming the DNA match beyond any doubt. The convoy of police vehicles moved slowly down Lyndale Street, red and blue lights flashing across the snow. Reporters, tipped off by scanners, were already arriving. Cameras captured the moment as Ellison, cuffed and scowling, was escorted into the county jail. By noon, the headline blazed across news outlets statewide. "Helena mechanic arrested in 2011 murder of young mother." Inside the sheriff's office, the Parker family was waiting. When Bennett entered the room, Margaret and James stood immediately. Their eyes searched her face. Bennett spoke softly but firmly. "We got him." Margaret collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. James whispered through clenched teeth, "After all these years, justice is finally here." For them, the arrest did not erase the pain of their loss, but it brought a measure of peace they had long been denied. That evening, Helena gathered in hushed groups across the city. At the grocery store, in diners, at church gatherings, the conversation was the same. The killer was one of their own. A man they had trusted with their cars, who had lived less than a mile from Lauren Parker, had carried a dark secret for nearly 10 years. The shock rippled through the community, shattering any lingering belief that such evil only came from the outside. For Detective Bennett, the arrest was both a victory and a reminder. The journey was not finished. The case would now move into the courtroom, where Ellison would face the full weight of the evidence. But for the first time in almost a decade, Helena could breathe. The man who had haunted their city had finally been unmasked. When the news of Mark Ellison's arrest spread across Helena, shock quickly turned into questions. Why had he killed Lauren Parker? What possible motive could explain such violence? As prosecutors prepared their case, the details of Ellison's dark history began to surface, revealing a picture far more disturbing than most had imagined. Investigators discovered that Ellison had known Lauren, though only in passing. His garage was less than a mile from her apartment, and records showed that she had once brought her car there for a repair in the spring of 2011. Witnesses recalled that Ellison had made comments about her appearance, calling her the pretty nurse. At the time, the remarks seemed harmless, even clumsy. In hindsight, they revealed a fixation. Prosecutors argued that Ellison had developed an unhealthy obsession with Lauren. When she rejected his advances, subtle attempts to engage her in conversation, or offers of free work on her car, his interest turned to resentment. By the fall of 2011, he was struggling financially, drinking heavily, and living alone. Detectives believed he began watching Lauren's apartment, studying her routines. On the night of November 12th, when he saw her return home alone, he seized the opportunity. During pre-trial hearings, the defense attempted to paint Ellison as a hard-working man caught in a web of circumstantial evidence. They pointed out that he had no violent criminal history and argued that DNA transfer could have occurred through innocent contact. But the prosecution's case was overwhelming. The DNA found on Lauren's body matched Ellison with certainty. The scratches on his hand, documented in early police notes, aligned with the defensive wounds on Lauren. His alibi had been proven false. The trial began in the spring of 2021 at the Lewis and Clark County Courthouse. Crowds filled the gallery each day, with reporters broadcasting every development. Lauren's parents sat in the front row, their faces etched with grief but also determination. For them, the trial was not just about punishment. It was about finally telling the truth of what had happened to their daughter. Witness after witness testified. Neighbors described seeing Ellison near Lyndale Street on the night of the murder. Forensic experts explained the DNA process in meticulous detail, walking the jury through the chain of custody from 2011 to the match in 2020. Genetic genealogists described how the family tree had been constructed, narrowing the suspect pool until only Ellison remained. The most powerful testimony came from Lauren's best friend, who recounted the final text message Lauren had sent that night. Finally, a quiet night. Her voice broke as she read it aloud, knowing that within an hour of writing those words, Lauren's life had been taken. When Ellison took the stand, he denied everything. His voice was flat, his eyes avoiding the jury. He insisted he had never entered Lauren's apartment and claimed the DNA evidence was flawed. But under cross-examination, he faltered. Asked why he had lied about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, he stumbled for an answer. The prosecution seized on that hesitation, pointing to it as proof of guilt. After 3 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of aggravated sexual assault, guilty of burglary. The words rang through the courtroom, final and undeniable. Margaret Parker wept openly, clutching her husband's hand. James stared straight ahead, silent but relieved. For them, the verdict brought a measure of closure that had been denied for almost 10 years. Ellison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led from the courtroom in shackles, there was no outburst, no display of remorse, only silence. For Helena, the trial marked the end of a nightmare. The community had lived under the shadow of uncertainty for nearly a decade, and now justice had finally spoken. The name Lauren Parker would forever be remembered, not just as a victim, but as a symbol of perseverance, of a family and a city that refused to let her story fade. For almost 10 years, the murder of Lauren Parker haunted Helena. A young mother taken in her own home, her family left with nothing but questions. Through persistence and new forensic science, the truth finally surfaced. The man who had hidden in plain sight was unmasked, convicted, and sentenced. Lauren's story is one of loss, but also of resilience. It proves that even the coldest cases can one day be solved. Every week we uncover stories where time may pass, but secrets refuse to stay buried. Subscribe and follow to hear the truth behind the world's most haunting cold cases.